This video is going to be looking at a specific process in Illustrator, and that's going to be the blending process. And this is something that's a little bit less tied to a specific exercise that we're working with in any of the modules, and more just a fun tool that I like to work with. And it can be also very useful when you have a project where the specific processes that this tool can perform are actually required. So nothing that is essential to any of the specific projects for the course, at least not right now, but definitely something that I do want to show people how to work with an Illustrator. And I talk a lot about how Illustrator is this really powerful program, and part of being able to work with this program is knowing all the different capabilities it has and all the different things that you can do with it when that kind of challenge or when that visual goal comes into your own work. So let's look at the blend tool. The blend tool is over here. It's in the toolbar, and this is pretty much what it looks like in all the different versions, and it is on the toolbar even in earlier versions of Illustrator. And what the main concept behind the tool is that you can use it to create a blend, so create intermediate objects from one object to another object. So you can also use it to create a smooth gradient of color from one object to another object. I tend to use it more to create these intermediate objects, and probably better to show versus try and explain it. I'm going to select this blend tool. I'm going to double click it just to see where my options are set at. So right now I have it set to create specified steps. So what this is going to do is this is going to create 4 intermediate objects that will visually show the transition from one object to another object. So in order to use this, and you see when I hold this cursor over these different objects that changes, and this is saying basically, oh, you can use this to blend. So I'm going to, in order to start or initiate the blend, I'm just going to click, using this cursor, I'm going to click on one object first. And you don't need the objects to be selected, and I actually think that sometimes that might make the tool behave a little bit erratically, or maybe it behaves how it's supposed to and I just don't know. And then you go to the other object, and then you see the cursor changes, and so instead of having that little asterisk down in the bottom right of the cursor, you have this little plus. And so I'm going to click that, and I now have these 4 intermediate shapes that are showing the transformation from this object to this object. So it's more, I call it a transformation, Illustrator calls it a blend, and what it's doing is it's taking the vector properties of these different objects and creating these morphs, interpolating what the 2 parent objects are, what the starting object and the ending object is, and then it's creating these little intermediate steps in between. So right now, since these 2 objects are identical, or mostly identical in terms of the scale and their fill colors, and neither of them have outlines, you can't really tell what is going on except for the shape. So the only thing that's really blending is the shape. So I want to show what happens when you apply the same blend to 2 objects that have a different fill color as well as a different shape. So now you see that the blend has created the same or similar intermediate objects here, but then it's also blending the color. And so you have these 4 steps that are these measured steps that show the intermediate steps from the transformation from this square with a black fill applied to it to this circle with a blue fill applied to it. Then I'm going to go over here, and then this one is almost the same, except this one also has an outline applied to it. And I want to show, whoops, oh, well, didn't want to do that. Oh, that's what happens when you have the thing selected and then you hit something else. Oh, great, now we know. So I'm going to select this, and then here you can see that not only are these inner fills changing and blending, but these outlines are blending as well. So this blue circle had this black outline applied to it. This black square had this blue outline applied to it. And so now you see in these intermediate steps, those outlines are also transforming and also blending together. So as I am working with these blends and using the direct selection tool to illustrate them, you might notice that I can't actually select these intermediate steps. And The reason why is because right now Illustrator hasn't actually created these intermediate steps as independent objects yet, and it's retaining the blend information. So the cool thing about that is that you can then go and even after creating the blend, if you select one of the parent objects or one of the starting objects and then change the properties associated with that object, it will also change the intermediate steps. And that is very helpful, so you're not having to constantly undo blends and then redo them. And you can also fine-tune your blends by changing the properties of these different starting objects. So not only can you change the fill colors of these objects, you can transform them, you can change their shapes, and then that is always going to, as long as the blend is still being applied to these two objects, whenever you change the starting objects themselves, it will also change the intermediate objects. So let's change the shape on that. And so you can see how this really can be a useful way of when you're trying to show transitions or when you're trying to show different steps, and especially working with this theme of transformation with these vector objects, this blend can make it very easy to have a lot of fun with that and to really experiment and explore those different transformations that can take place. So you are working with the color and then also the shape. So another way to adjust the blend after you've created the blend is to actually use the blend options itself. So one way is what I just showed, which is changing the starting objects. And then the other way is to actually change the options of the blend. So I have selected this object, and then one way to bring up the dialog box for the blend options is to double click the blend tool with the object selected. And then this will allow you to change different options of the blend. So let's say I wanted this to have eight objects, or let's say I wanted it to be 20 objects. You can see how you're able to change these different blend options as well. And then this is another thing that you can work with. Let me select this, and let me show the other way to pull up that blend option. So when I have the object that has the blend applied to it that I am wanting to edit further selected, I go up to the object menu, I go to blend, and then I go to blend options, and that gives me the same dialog box. So sometimes it can be helpful. Either way is going to produce the same result. You just want to make sure that you do have the blend selected that you are trying to edit. So I'm going to now show what the smooth color blend does. Make sure I have preview selected. So this is now showing how instead of creating distinct objects as intermediate steps, it will, when you have the smooth color option selected, it will create this blend. And let me, smooth color. So this will instead create this smooth blend. It's more of a color gradient, and let me hit OK here. Even when you change these different points, it doesn't really change the intermediate objects. It mostly just changes the direction, and then there's going to be slight variations in the color. So as I have stated before, I work with the specified steps a little bit more than I work with the color. And I do use the specified steps to not only create intermediate shapes, but also to create and to be able to pull out different color values. So this can be helpful when I'm working with a poster and I need to have a gradient, or I'm not wanting to have any gradients on it, but I am wanting to have colors that have this relationship. So I would maybe pull out this color, then a middle color, and then the end color. And then what this helps me do is this helps me find these specific values. So I can say, okay, well, this is 25%, 50%, 75% of these two colors blended together. So more of a fun process to experiment with. The last thing I want to show is how to, in specific to the blends and just the features of this tool, is how to actually be able to work with these specific objects themselves. So I have the direct selection tool, and I can change these starting objects, but I can't really play around with any of these intermediate objects, and maybe I want to do that. So how do I make this so that these are so that Illustrator is seeing these objects as independent objects? So what I have to do is I have to expand the blend. So again, making sure that this is selected, and let me change this to 3, just so I have some more distinct objects. So let's say that in my poster, I'm really wanting to use this shape, and I just couldn't create this shape on my own with the pen tool. But I right now, as it stands, with the blend still engaged and without expanding that effect, I can't actually manipulate this object as though it's its own object. So I'm going to select this and go up to Object and then go to Blend, and then I'm going to hit Expand. And so what that's going to do is that is now going to break the blend. So Illustrator no longer sees this as a blend. So if I, now using the direct selection tool, try to change this first object and wishing that it was going to change all these intermediate objects, that's not going to happen anymore because Illustrator has forgotten that there was ever a blend associated with these two objects. But now you can see I can pull out these intermediate objects and I can edit them and move them around as though they are independent objects, because now they are. And I think, so once you expand a blend, Illustrator groups it, but you can always Command-Shift-G to ungroup, and then you can even just using the selection tool, you can then move all these different objects around independently and change properties and edit them as you would any other object in Illustrator. So last thing I want to show with this tool, I just want to show that you can use this for, let's see here, all right. You can use this with text, and that is pretty, something that I think is a really amazing feature of Illustrator. So I'm going to have this text object selected, and I'm going to blend it. So I'm going to blend, click on this W, and then go up to this other text object, and then hovering over the D, I'm going to select that. And now you see it has done this with the text, which is very cool. And I think it creates some very interesting typographies, and then it also, in these different letter forms. And so it's showing these different transformations. And you can also, it'll also do things like change the color. Let me select just that. And then it'll apply different blends to each of these different text objects. And when you're working with text, you can also change the letters, and then it will show up as these transformations will show up, which I think is another really interesting feature. And so the same thing happens with this. If you are wanting to use one of these as an independent object, you just make sure to select the blend, you go up to Object, and then you go to Blend, and then you say Expand, and then you are able to edit each of these different objects separately. So this is a really interesting way to create unique fonts and different letter forms and typographies, and that's something that we have definitely been talking about in this class. And then the last thing I want to show with this tool is that you can use it with more complex shapes as well. So I have a deer and a wolf silhouette here, and these are just complex shapes. If you zoom in, you see it's just a Bezier curve, so a curve tool created with the pen tool, and in the shape of a wolf and a deer. And so I'm going to, let's see, I'll change some colors here. Green deer. And let's do a red wolf, blue wolf. So then, taking the blend tool, going to select the wolf, then I'm going to select the deer, and then you get these cool, these great little intermediate object, wolf, deer, deer, wolf, derolf animals that you can then, once you go up to Object and Blend and Expand, and then I'm going to ungroup this. So then you can sit here and play with your strange, transformed, blended animals. And so this is something, obviously, zooming in on these, you can see there's a little bit of artifacts that come up, and it's not this totally perfect process, but I think that it can be a really interesting starting point when you're working with themes of transformation and transitions and these different steps. And I think that it produces some really unique geometries and shapes. So there's a lot of different functions for this tool. It can be something that you're using to create more of a final visual or graphic. It can also be something that you're using as a starting off point or as an intermediate step. So definitely a fun way to explore the different shapes and colors and then the transformations between the two.